In the deep, suffocating heat of the Georgia Piedmont, history is a physical presence, a weight in the air as heavy and humid as a summer storm. The city of Macon, in the year 1853, was a place of burgeoning cotton wealth and fervent public piety. It was a city built on red clay and the unbending certainty of its own righteousness. On the 14th of May, a Thursday, the citizens prepared to observe Ascension Day, a holy commemoration of Christ's final ascent from earth to heaven. But on that day, transcendence would be answered with a terrible, profane descent. Within a handsome brick house on a street shaded by magnolias, an enslaved man named Cudjo would commit an act of such calculated brutality that it would sear itself into the town's memory, not for the act alone, but for the detail that accompanied it. He was reported to have smiled while he worked. If the quiet brutalities of the past demand a witness, and you are new to this archive, subscribe now to join our inquest and follow every shadow to its source. The day began not with the sun, but with a sound. It was the first solitary peal of a church bell, a single, resonant bronze note that traveled from the steeple of Christ Church, rolling out over the sleeping city. It was a sound intended to mark the sanctity of the hour, a call to remember the divine. But in the pre-dawn stillness, it served another purpose. It was the city's chronometer, the audible gear that set the entire complex machinery of Macon into motion. The sound drifted over the wide, unpaved expanse of Mulberry Street, where the grand houses of the cotton brokers and lawyers stood silent and dark. It crossed the Ocmulgee River, its surface shrouded in a thick, spectral mist that clung to the cypress trees along its banks. It settled over the hundreds of small, unlit cabins of the enslaved quarters, where the vast majority of the city's population was already stirring. Long before that first bell, the true work of the day had already begun in the shadows, in the quiet, purposeful movements of the men and women who were the city's engine. Fires were being kindled in the kitchens of the main houses, their first thin tendrils of wood smoke rising into the dark, humid air. The scent, a mixture of pine and oak, mingled with the damp, loamy smell of the river and the sweet, cloying perfume of the night-blooming jasmine that grew in tangled abundance in every garden. As the eastern sky began to bleed from black to a bruised, episcopal purple, the physical character of Macon revealed itself. It was a city of raw, stark contrasts. The red clay of the earth was a constant presence, a fine, staining dust that coated every surface. It settled on the glossy leaves of the magnolias, it crept through the floorboards of the finest homes, and it turned to a thick, clinging mud with every rainstorm. The roads were rivers of this red earth, rutted and uneven, a testament to the constant traffic of wagons piled high with cotton bales making their way to the river wharves. Against this raw, elemental backdrop, the town's elite had imposed a vision of ordered, classical elegance. Their houses were monuments of brick and white-painted timber, with tall columns and deep, shaded piazzas designed to offer some respite from the oppressive Georgia heat. These structures were islands of pristine, man-made order in a landscape that always seemed to be trying to reclaim its territory. The humidity was a relentless adversary, causing paint to peel and wood to swell. The gardens, though carefully tended, were in a constant battle with the wild, exuberant growth of the native flora. Macon was a city built on a foundation of control, a perpetual effort to tame the land and the people who worked it. On this Ascension Day, the city's rituals of control were to be on full display. This was a day of profound religious significance for the Episcopal and Methodist congregations that constituted the city's white elite. It was a day for solemn reflection on the nature of Christ's divinity, on the promise of heaven, and on the divinely sanctioned order of the world. As the sun finally broke through the river mist, its light a hazy, golden wash, The rhythms of the city began to diverge sharply. From the main houses, the sounds were of quiet, reverent preparation. The clink of silver on porcelain as the morning meal was served, the rustle of starched linen and silk as families dressed in their finest Sunday attire, though it was a Thursday. Their movements were slow, deliberate, imbued with the gravity of the occasion. They would speak in hushed tones, their conversations focused on the coming church service, on the expected sermon from the rector, a man known for his scholarly and orthodox interpretations of Scripture. Their world on this morning was one of interior, spiritual contemplation, a state of grace made possible by the labor that swirled, largely unseen, around them. Outside these islands of piety, a different rhythm prevailed. The enslaved population moved with a practiced, efficient energy. They were the hands that had polished the silver, starched the linen, and cooked the morning meal. Now, their duties continued. The stable hands were grooming the horses and polishing the brass fittings on the carriages that would soon convey the families to church. The yard workers were sweeping the piazzas and trimming the stray branches that dared to disrupt the perfect symmetry of the gardens. They moved with a quiet, shared understanding of their roles, their communication often nonverbal, a simple nod or a gesture conveying a whole set of instructions. Their world was one of immediate, physical tasks, of constant, unceasing work. The pealing of the church bells was not a call to worship for them. It was a time marker, a signal that one set of tasks must be completed before the next began. The theological significance of Ascension Day was a distant, abstract concept, a part of the Master's world, as inaccessible to them as the locked libraries and formal drawing rooms of the houses they served. It was within this stratified and ritualized world that a man named Cudjo moved. He was known as a quiet man, even by the standards of a population that had learned the survival value of quietness. He was tall and powerfully built, the muscles in his back and shoulders forged by years of hard, physical labor. His face was a mask of impassivity, his eyes deep-set and watchful. On this morning, his duties were centered around the household of his master, a man of considerable standing in the community, a cotton factor who owned this handsome house in the city, as well as a larger plantation several miles downriver. Cudjo was not a field hand. His role was closer to that of a groundskeeper and general laborer for the town residents. His tasks were varied and constant. On this Ascension Day morning, he had risen in the darkness of the enslaved quarters, a small cluster of whitewashed cabins behind the main house. His first task was to bring water from the well, the wooden buckets heavy, the rope coarse and abrasive against his palms. He then had to split and carry firewood to the kitchen, stacking it neatly by the massive hearth, where the cook, an older woman named Patience, was already at work. He moved with an economy of motion that wasted no energy. His bare feet made little sound on the packed earth of the yard. As the White family began their day, Cudjo's tasks shifted. He was summoned to the back of the house by the master to receive his instructions for the day. The master was a man whose authority was so absolute that he rarely needed to raise his voice. His power was conveyed in his posture, in the unwavering certainty of his gaze. He stood on the back piazza, already dressed for church in a severe black coat, sipping a cup of coffee. He did not look directly at Cudjo as he spoke. He addressed his words to the air, his tone flat and businesslike. He informed Cudjo that after the family had departed for church, he was to clear a section of the back lot that had become overgrown with kudzu and thorny brush. It was a difficult, punishing task, especially as the day promised to be exceptionally hot. The master added that he wanted the work completed by the time he returned from his business affairs in the afternoon. It was not a request, it was a statement of fact, an imposition of his will upon the day, upon the land, and upon the body of the man who stood before him. Cudjo received these instructions with a slight inclination of his head. He offered no verbal response. None was expected. His role was to hear, to understand, and to obey. The exchange was brief, a perfect microcosm of the power dynamic that governed their entire existence. The master, his duty done, turned and went back into the house, the screen door clicking shut behind him. Cudjo stood for a moment in the yard, the master's words hanging in the humid air. The sun was higher now, and the heat was already beginning to press down, a physical weight on the shoulders. The cicadas had begun their incessant, high-pitched drone in the trees, a sound that would grow in intensity as the day wore on, the soundtrack to the sweltering Georgia summer. From the front of the house, he could hear the sound of the family gathering, the light laughter of the master's wife, the impatient questions of their children. Soon, the carriage would be brought around, and they would depart, their souls prepared for a morning of spiritual ascent. Cudjo turned and walked toward the tool shed, a small, weathered structure at the edge of the property. The air inside was cool and dark, smelling of earth, oil, and old wood. He ran his hand over the worn, smooth handles of the tools that hung in neat rows on the wall. The hoe, the axe, the scythe. His tools were his constant companions, extensions of his own arms, the instruments through which he imposed his master's will upon the landscape. On this day, he selected a heavy brush hook, its curved blade sharpened to a razor's edge. He tested the edge with his thumb, his expression unchanging. The final church bell was now ringing, a steady, insistent summons. The time for worship was at hand. The transition from the public piety of the city to the private, enclosed world of the master's household was complete. The stage was set, the day's holy rituals providing the backdrop for an act of the most profane and brutal rupture imaginable. The departure of the family for church created a sudden and dramatic shift in the household's atmosphere. The carriage, with its polished brass and disciplined horses, rolled away from the front of the house, its wheels crunching on the gravel of the drive. The sound faded, leaving behind a quiet that was fundamentally different from the reverent hush of the preceding hour. This was a functional silence, the silence of a workshop after the owners have left, a space where the true, unadorned business of the day could commence. The house was now an engine with its primary governor removed. It did not cease to function. Rather, its operations became more stark, its purpose distilled to the raw mechanics of maintenance and servitude, all under the watchful eye of the master who had remained behind, choosing to attend to his ledgers rather than to his soul. The master of the house, a man named Jabez, was the central gear in this domestic machine. His authority was not predicated on the overt, boisterous brutality of a plantation overseer, but on a far more invasive and meticulous system of control. He was a man obsessed with order, with the belief that the world, from the price of cotton futures to the lives of the people he owned, could be managed and perfected through rigorous, unceasing administration. His study was the nerve center of his domain. It was a dark, masculine room, paneled in heart pine that had been stained the color of dried blood. The air within was always thick with the scent of leather-bound books, drying ink, and the faint, sweet aroma of the bourbon he often took in the late afternoon. The most dominant piece of furniture was a massive mahogany desk, its surface a landscape of precisely arranged papers, a sand-filled inkwell, and a row of sharpened quill pens. It was here that he spent a significant portion of his life, transcribing reality into a series of neat, spidery columns in his numerous ledgers. He had a ledger for household expenses, a ledger for his business accounts, and a third, thicker volume that contained the names of his human property. In this book, individuals were reduced to a name, an age, a monetary value, and notes on their skills or perceived deficiencies. The existence of this book, often left open on his desk, was a constant, unspoken reminder to the enslaved that they were assets, entries in a column, their humanity a footnote to their economic function. Jabez's one private obsession, the single detail that hinted at a world beyond his ledgers, was a collection of river stones he kept in a series of shallow wooden trays in his study. He had gathered them over the years from the banks of the Ocmulgee, selecting only those that were perfectly smooth and ovoid. Each evening, he would take out a soft cloth and polish them, one by one, their surfaces gleaming under the lamplight. It was a habit of quiet, focused control, a man polishing and ordering the most elemental pieces of the earth. He treated the people he owned with a similar, if more detached, proprietary care. He saw to it that they were fed, clothed, and housed, not out of any sense of compassion, but because a well-maintained tool performs its function more effectively. His cruelty was not the hot-blooded anger of a tyrant, but the cold, dispassionate logic of an accountant. A person who worked too slowly was an inefficient asset. A person who showed any sign of insolence was a flaw in the system that needed to be corrected before it could disrupt the entire mechanism. His punishments were delivered not with rage, but with a quiet, disappointed finality, which made them all the more terrifying. Cudjo's duties, and the duties of the half-dozen other enslaved people who maintained the Macon residence, were governed by this philosophy of absolute efficiency. Their days were not their own. They were partitioned by the ringing of bells and the unspoken schedule of the master's needs. Their movements through the house were circumscribed by a set of invisible but rigid boundaries. They were to use the back stairs, their footsteps muffled by the worn, uncarpeted wood. They were to enter a room only when summoned, and to stand near the door, their eyes downcast, until they were addressed. They were to speak only when spoken to, and to keep their answers brief and direct. This code of conduct was so deeply ingrained that it had become a kind of second nature, a physical language of submission that was performed without conscious thought. But for Cudjo, this performance of obedience was a carefully maintained facade, a mask of docility that concealed a mind that was constantly observing, cataloging, and weighing. His impassive expression was a shield. Behind it, he was a silent archivist of slights, a keeper of a private, unwritten ledger of every small humiliation, every casual act of dehumanization. His inner life was a fortress, the one space that Jabez's meticulous administration could not penetrate. On this Ascension Day, Cudjo began the task his master had assigned him. He went to the back lot, a neglected patch of ground behind the formal garden, and faced the tangled, impenetrable wall of green. The heat was already a palpable force, a wet, heavy blanket that made every breath a conscious effort. The air was alive with the buzzing of insects and the relentless, mechanical drone of the cicadas. He took up the brush hook, its weight familiar in his hands. The handle was smooth and dark from years of use, worn to the shape of his grip. He began to work, his movements powerful and rhythmic. Each swing of the blade was a study in controlled force, the sharp steel shearing through the thick, woody vines of the kudzu with a satisfying percussive thwack. He worked without pause, his body falling into the familiar cadence of hard labor. Sweat soaked his thin cotton shirt, plastering it to the powerful muscles of his back. The sun beat down on his head and neck. It was brutal, exhausting work, designed to empty the mind and break the body. But Cudjo's mind was not empty. With every swing, with every vine that fell, his focus grew more intense, his thoughts turning inward. The accumulation of humiliations was a slow, steady process, a constant, low-grade pressure that never ceased. It was in the way the master called him boy, though Cudjo was a man in his prime. It was in the leftover food that was scraped from the family's plates and given to the enslaved for their evening meal, a constant reminder of their place at the bottom of the food chain. It was in the lack of a lock on the door of his cabin, a physical manifestation of the fact that his life contained no privacy, that his body, his time, and his meager possessions were all subject to the master's whim. Earlier that week, Jabez had accused Cudjo of misplacing a garden trowel. He had not shouted. He had simply stood before Cudjo and explained, in a calm, pedantic tone, the monetary value of the tool and the irresponsibility demonstrated by its loss. He had informed Cudjo that the cost of the trowel would be noted in his ledger, a debt to be held against him. 2 days later, the master's own young son was seen playing with the trowel near the stables. When this was pointed out to Jabez, he had simply nodded, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of his false accusation. The entry in the ledger was not corrected. The incident was small, almost trivial, but it was one more drop of poison in a vessel that was already full. Around mid-morning, as Cudjo was piling the cut brush into a large mound for burning, Jabez emerged from the back of the house. He had a glass of water in his hand. He did not offer it to Cudjo. He stood in the shade of a large oak tree, watching Cudjo work, his expression critical. After several minutes of silent observation, he pointed to a section of the cleared ground. He said that Cudjo had not cut the vines close enough to the earth. He explained that leaving the roots so high would only allow them to grow back more quickly, and that he would not pay for work that had to be done twice. The accusation was patently unfair. The ground was riddled with rocks and hidden stumps, making it impossible to cut any lower without damaging the blade. Cudjo knew this, and he knew that Jabez knew it as well. The criticism was not about the quality of the work. It was an assertion of power, a reminder that the master was the sole arbiter of what was acceptable, that his perception was the only reality that mattered. Cudjo stopped his work. He looked at the ground, and then he looked at Jabez. For a brief, dangerous moment, his impassive mask faltered. A flicker of something hard and unreadable passed through his eyes. Jabez saw it. He took a slow sip of his water. He then told Cudjo to do it again, and to do it properly this time. He turned and walked back to the house, leaving the unfinished glass of water on a nearby bench, a final, casual gesture of his complete disregard. Cudjo watched him go. He looked at the glass of cool, clear water, condensation beating on its sides. He looked at the wall of tangled brush yet to be cleared. He looked at his hands, at the calluses, and the small, bleeding scratches from the thorns. The claustrophobia of his existence pressed in on him. It was not just the physical confines of the property. It was the suffocating, inescapable nature of his master's control, which extended to the very ground beneath his feet, to the quality of his labor, to the contents of his mind. Agency, the power to act, was a concept that had no meaning in his world. Every movement was dictated, every hour was owned. But in that moment, standing in the oppressive heat of the Georgia sun, a new and terrible understanding of agency began to form in the silent, hidden spaces of his mind. If all his actions were owned by another, then perhaps the only truly independent act available to him was one that would shatter the entire mechanism of control. The ticking of the grandfather clock from within the master's study seemed to grow louder, each tick a steady, metronomic beat, counting down to the moment when the accumulated pressure would find its release, the moment when the quiet rage and the holy day would finally, irrevocably intersect. The glass of water Jabez had left on the bench became the focal point of the world. In the shimmering heat haze that rose from the baked red clay, it seemed to vibrate with a profound significance. It was an object of casual, thoughtless power. He had taken what he needed from it and abandoned the rest. confident that the vessel would be retrieved, washed, and refilled at his next command. For Cudjo, standing in the relentless, punishing sun, the glass was not just a glass. It was a perfect, crystalline symbol of the master's entire worldview. It was the distillation of 1,000 similar moments, 1,000 assumptions of service, 1,000 instances of being treated as a piece of functional, unfeeling equipment. He stared at it for a long, unblinking minute, the drone of the cicadas seeming to intensify, to synchronize with the furious, silent beating of his own heart. The breaking point was not a fracture. It was not a sudden, explosive snap of a mind under pressure. It was a moment of terrifying, preternatural clarity. It was the final entry in a long and meticulous ledger that he had kept hidden in the deepest, most inaccessible part of his soul. The account was now full. The debt had come due. He turned away from the glass and went back to his work. But the nature of the labor had changed. His movements, which before had been the rhythmic, semi-conscious motions of a man long accustomed to his toil, were now imbued with a new and chilling deliberateness. Each swing of the brush hook was precise, economical, and final. He was no longer simply clearing the land. He was rehearsing. The sharp, percussive sound of the blade biting into the woody vines was the only sound he made. He did not grunt with the effort. He did not sigh in the heat. He worked in a profound, inhuman silence, his face a mask of absolute concentration. The sun climbed higher in the sky, reaching its zenith, the point of the day when shadows shrink to nothing and the heat is at its most brutal. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The birds were silent in the trees. The usual sounds of the city, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a wagon on a far-off street, seemed to have faded away, leaving only the heat, the cicadas, and the rhythmic, metronomic fall of Cudjo's blade. He was finishing his master's task, but he was doing it on his own terms now, transforming an act of obedience into the final, necessary preparation for an act of absolute, world-ending defiance. At precisely noon, the bell of Christ Church began to toll, a slow, solemn series of notes that marked the midday hour. At the sound, a window on the ground floor of the main house slid open with a faint squeal of protest. Jabez's voice, thin and sharp in the still air, called his name. Cudjo did not startle. He had been expecting it. He completed the swing he had begun, the blade severing a thick tangle of thorny briar. He lowered the brush hook and carefully, deliberately, leaned it against the trunk of a water oak. He did not take it with him. The tool for that task was done. He would need a different kind of instrument for the work that was to come. He wiped his hands on his rough cotton trousers and began to walk toward the house. His bare feet made no sound on the scorched grass of the yard. The transition from the blinding, white-hot glare of the sun to the cool, deep shade of the back piazza was a sudden, disorienting shock. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dimness. The interior of the house was a different world. The air was cool and still, smelling of lemon oil and old paper. The oppressive drone of the cicadas was instantly muted, replaced by the steady, authoritative ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. It was the sound of the master's time, a mechanical, unyielding measurement of a life of order and control. Cudjo walked through the rear of the house, his presence an alien intrusion into this space of polished, domestic tranquility. His sweat-soaked shirt, his bare feet leaving faint, damp prints on the heart pine floors, were a violation of the house's pristine order. He passed the dining room, where the table was covered in a white linen cloth, awaiting the family's return. He passed the bottom of the main staircase, its banister polished to a dark, lustrous sheen. He was moving toward the study, the house's heart of darkness, the room where the ink and paper reality of his bondage was given its form. He did not hesitate. His steps were as steady and measured as the ticking of the clock. He paused at the open doorway of the study. Jabez was at his desk, his back to the door, hunched over one of his ledgers. He was so absorbed in his work, in the precise, intricate dance of his quill pen across the page, that he had not heard Cudjo's approach. A single shaft of sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, fell from a high window, illuminating the back of his head, the neat part in his dark hair, the severe black wool of his coat. The room was a shrine to his power. The leather-bound books that lined the walls, the framed maps of the county, the shallow trays of smooth, gray river stones, they were all artifacts of a world he had collected, categorized, and owned. He finished a line of script with a final, decisive flourish, then spoke without turning around. He informed Cudjo that a new crate of legal texts had been delivered and left in the hall. He said he wanted it brought into the study and placed against the far wall. His voice was distracted, the command a mere afterthought to the more important work of his accounting. Cudjo did not move. He did not speak. He stood in the doorway, a tall, silent silhouette against the brighter light of the hall. The silence stretched. The only sound was the clock, ticking, ticking, ticking. Jabez, accustomed to instantaneous obedience, registered the lack of response. Annoyance flickered across his face. He put down his pen with a small, sharp tap and turned in his chair, his mouth already forming a reprimand, but the words died in his throat. He saw Cudjo standing there, and for the first time in his life, he truly looked at the man he owned. He saw the expression on Cudjo's face. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was not any emotion that Jabez could name or categorize. And then he saw the smile. It was a slight, almost imperceptible lifting at the corners of the mouth, but it was the most terrifying thing Jabez had ever seen. It was a smile of absolute, final knowledge. It was the smile of a man who had just balanced his own ledger and was now ready to close the book. Jabez's mind, a thing of logic and order, could not process this. He felt a cold, prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He asked Cudjo what he was smiling at, his voice a dry, uncertain whisper. Cudjo did not answer the question. He took one step into the room, and then another. His movement was fluid, silent, and unstoppable. The smile did not waver. Jabez tried to rise from his chair, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy glass paperweight on his desk, but it was too late. The intricate, carefully constructed world of his study, the world of his ledgers and his laws, was about to be invaded by a physical reality he could not control. The act itself was a thing of shocking, brutal swiftness. There was a sudden, violent motion. The scrape of the heavy chair being pushed back, a single, choked cry of disbelief that was cut short. Then a heavy, sickening thud as a body hit the floorboards, the impact vibrating through the room, causing one of the trays of river stones to rattle on its shelf. A quill pen rolled off the edge of the desk and fell to the floor, its nib snapping. The shaft of sunlight was momentarily interrupted and then returned, its light now falling upon a dark, spreading stain on the polished pine. The silence that followed was heavier, deeper than before. The clock in the hall continued to tick, an indifferent observer. Cudjo stood over the body of his master, his breathing even, his expression calm. The smile was gone now, replaced by his familiar, impassive mask. He looked around the room, at the tools of his master's power, the books, the maps, the ledgers. He then turned and left the study, walking with the same deliberate pace back toward the rear of the house. He retrieved a heavy wood axe from the chopping block by the kitchen door. He returned to the study and closed the door behind him. The historical accounts, compiled from the panicked and horrified testimony that would follow, report what was found hours later. They report that Cudjo worked for a long time in that silent, sunlit room. They report that he performed a methodical, almost surgical dismemberment of his master. And they all agree on the most haunting, inexplicable detail, a detail that must have been pieced together from some forced, post-capture confession that is otherwise lost to history, that for the entire duration of his terrible work, the quiet, unnerving smile had returned to his face. He was not a man in the grip of a frenzied rage. He was a laborer completing a task. The master had ordered him to clear the unruly brush from the yard. He had simply, in the end, decided to clear the house as well. The noon air was still. The holy day was at its peak. The rupture was complete. The silence waited to be broken. The silence that had claimed the house on Mulberry Street was a different entity by mid-afternoon. The earlier quiet had been one of purpose and solitude, the silence of a man at work. The new silence was a dead, hollow thing, a vacuum that seemed to actively absorb sound. The grandfather clock in the hall continued its relentless, mechanical ticking, but the sound was now obscene, a profane metronome, counting out the seconds of an unspeakable aftermath. The shaft of sunlight that fell through the study window had shifted, its angle now lower, its color a deeper, more buttery gold. It illuminated a scene of profound, geometric horror, an order of a new and terrible kind. The house waited. It was a vessel now, a sealed container holding a secret that would soon shatter the carefully constructed peace of the entire city. The cicadas outside continued their shrill, indifferent chorus, their song a constant, high-pitched thrum that underscored the unnatural stillness within. The first disruption came with the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. It was the family returning from church and the subsequent social calls that were an obligatory part of any holy day for Macon's elite. The mistress of the house, a woman named Annabelle, was the first to alight. Her 2 young children followed, their faces flushed from the heat and the excitement of the day. As they ascended the steps to the front piazza, an immediate sense of wrongness settled upon Annabelle. The front door was unlatched. Cudjo, or one of the other house servants, should have been waiting to open it. The air was unnaturally still. There was no scent of the midday meal being prepared, no sound of movement from within. The house stood before them, not as a welcoming sanctuary, but as a silent, inscrutable facade. She called out a name, then another, her voice sounding small and thin in the oppressive quiet. There was no reply. A thread of unease, cold and sharp, began to weave itself through the fabric of the warm afternoon. She entered the house, the children trailing behind her, their earlier ebullience replaced by a wary, watchful silence. The ticking of the clock was the only sound that greeted them. Annabelle walked through the downstairs rooms, her unease blossoming into a palpable dread. Everything was in its place, the furniture polished, the floors clean, a testament to the morning's labor. But the absence of human presence was a palpable weight. The other servants were nowhere to be found. A search of the grounds would later reveal they had fled to the relative safety of the main enslaved quarters, a silent, communal acknowledgement that some terrible boundary had been crossed. Annabelle's search led her inevitably to her husband's study. The door was closed. This was unusual. Jabez never closed his study door during the day. He believed in the constant, visible performance of his own authority. She reached for the brass knob, a sense of cold, metallic finality transferring from the object into her own hand. She opened the door, and the carefully ordered world of Annabelle, of the house on Mulberry Street, of the city of Macon itself, came to an end. The historical record does not preserve the precise nature of her scream. It is remembered only as a sound, a single, sharp-edged articulation of a horror that had no other words. It tore through the house's stillness, a raw, animalistic sound of a soul being ripped apart. It brought the children running, and their own cries of uncomprehending terror joined their mothers, a discordant chorus of absolute ruin. A neighbor, a Mr. Abernathy who had been enjoying a late afternoon drink on his piazza, heard the screams. He was a man not given to haste, but the quality of that sound propelled him from his chair and across the manicured lawn that separated the two properties. He was the first outsider to witness the scene, the first to carry the tale, like a contagion, out into the wider world. He found Annabelle collapsed in the hallway, and he saw, through the open study door, enough to send him staggering back into the sunlight, his face the color of wet ash, shouting for the sheriff. The news of the event did not spread through Macon. It detonated. The arrival of the sheriff, a barrel-chested man named Beaumont, and the subsequent convergence of magistrates and other city officials on the house turned a private tragedy into a public spectacle. A crowd began to gather on the street, drawn by the magnetic, horrifying pull of the unknown. They stood at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and a dawning, collective fear. They spoke in hushed, urgent whispers, their words weaving the first frantic threads of rumor. The house itself became a focal point of dread, its windows like the dead eyes of a skull, the open front door, a dark mouth from which the terrible story had spilled. The sheriff's first questions were brutally simple. He asked where the man named Cudjo was. He asked when he had last been seen. The answers, a series of negatives and uncertainties, all pointed to a single, damning conclusion. He was gone. His absence from the scene was as powerful a piece of evidence as any bloodstain. The rumor mill, fueled by the potent combination of incomplete information and deep-seated racial terror, began to grind with a terrifying efficiency. The story that traveled through the white community was one of an almost demonic savagery. They said that Cudjo had been driven by a lust for the master's wife. They whispered that he was the leader of a secret heathenish cult that practiced blood sacrifice. The most potent and widespread rumor, the one that resonated with their deepest and most existential fears, was that this was not an isolated act, but the first move in a planned citywide slave insurrection. Ascension Day, they reasoned, had been chosen for its symbolic power, a day when the white population would be in their churches, their guard down, vulnerable to a coordinated attack. This theory took hold with the speed and intensity of a wildfire, transforming the grief and horror over a single man's death into a full-blown civic panic. Every enslaved person in Macon was now a potential conspirator, their familiar faces suddenly transformed into masks that concealed a murderous intent. The city's white population began to look at the people who served them, their food, and cared for their children with a new and profound suspicion. The very foundations of their domestic lives, built on the assumption of a docile and subservient labor force, had been shaken to their core. The news traveled just as quickly, though through different, more clandestine channels, among the enslaved community. It was a piece of information so dangerous that it could not be spoken aloud. It was communicated in the flick of an eye between two men loading cotton onto a dray, in the sudden shared silence of a group of women at the communal well. Their immediate reaction was not speculation about motive, but a cold, pragmatic fear of the inevitable consequences. They knew that the violence of one would be answered with a collective punishment. They knew that posses would be formed, that cabins would be searched, that any black person found on the streets after dark would be subject to summary and brutal justice. For them, Cudjo's act was not a symbol of rebellion to be celebrated. It was a catastrophe. It was a rock thrown into a hornet's nest, and they were the ones who would be stung. They began to perform their own rituals of control, their faces becoming masks of horrified disbelief, their condemnations of the act loud and vehement for any white person who might be listening. It was a necessary, life-saving piece of theater in a city that was rapidly losing its reason. By late afternoon, the city's response had begun to formalize. Sheriff Beaumont, acting on the authority of the terrified city magistrates, declared a state of emergency. A curfew was imposed on the entire enslaved population, effective immediately. Patrols of armed white citizens, many of them half-drunk and all of them gripped by a righteous, fearful anger, were organized. They moved through the city with a swaggering, menacing authority, their primary purpose not to find Cudjo, but to terrorize and intimidate the black community, to reassert the dominance that had been so shockingly challenged. The local printer was summoned to produce a broadside. In the flickering gaslight of his workshop, he hastily set the lead type, the words stark and inflammatory. It described the barbarous and inhuman murder of a respected citizen and offered a substantial reward for the capture of the runaway Negro, Cudjo, who was to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. By dusk, these notices were being nailed to the doors of the courthouse, the post office, and the city's taverns, the wet ink gleaming in the fading light. They were the official text of the city's panic, a formal declaration of war against an enemy that was both specific and terrifyingly general. That night, Macon was a city under siege from within. The patrols moved through the unlit lanes of the enslaved quarters, their lantern light cutting erratic, menacing arcs in the darkness. They burst into the small, cramped cabins without warning, their boots kicking over pots and scattering the meager possessions of the inhabitants. They dragged men out into the dirt and questioned them with the butt of a rifle or the flat of a hand. They were not looking for information. They were engaged in a ritual of resubjugation, a violent, city-wide reminder of who held the power. The truth of what had happened in Jabez's study was of no interest to them. They were not investigators seeking to understand a crime. They were the instruments of a social order that had been profoundly shaken, and their task was to restore that order through fear. Cudjo was found shortly after dawn the next day. He was not hiding in some deep swamp or remote forest. He was sitting on the banks of the Ocmulgee River, not a mile from the house where the crime had been committed. He was staring into the slow, muddy current, the brush hook he had used to clear the yard lying on the ground beside him. He had made no attempt to flee. When the posse, led by the sheriff himself, found him, he did not run or fight. He simply looked up at them, his face calm, his expression unreadable. He rose to his feet and allowed them to bind his hands without a word of protest. His capture brought a wave of grim relief to the city. The monster had been caged. The immediate threat was over. But his unnerving, silent passivity was a final, unsettling mystery. They had expected a cornered, dangerous animal. They found instead a man who seemed to have already traveled to a place beyond their reach, a place where their threats and their authority had no meaning. The phase of chaotic, public panic was over. The focus now shifted from the streets and the riverbank to the cold, formal architecture of the law. The city no longer needed a manhunt. It needed a trial. It needed a public, ritualized process that would transform their fear and rage into a verdict, a sentence, and a final, cleansing act of retribution. The courthouse square, shimmering in the morning heat, awaited its central actor. The legal proceedings that followed the capture of Cudjo were an exercise in civic ritual, not a pursuit of justice. The city of Macon, having endured a night of collective, racial terror, now required a public and authoritative reaffirmation of its core principles. The trial was the necessary theater for this reaffirmation, a carefully staged performance designed to transform the chaotic horror of the event into a clean, logical, and socially acceptable narrative of crime and punishment. The wheels of this judicial machinery began to turn with a swiftness that spoke to the urgency of the city's need for closure. Cudjo was not held in the county jail with common white criminals. He was confined to a stone-lined cell in the basement of the courthouse itself, a space normally reserved for the temporary holding of the condemned. This choice of location was symbolic, a prejudgment that effectively declared his guilt before a single piece of testimony had been heard. He was isolated, a dangerous artifact to be kept under heavy guard, away from both the general population and the enslaved community he was accused of attempting to incite. The court that was convened to hear his case was not a jury of his peers. It was a specially appointed tribunal of magistrates and freeholders, a panel of 7 white men drawn from the city's planter and merchant elite. They were the very architects and beneficiaries of the system that Cudjo had so violently assaulted. Their names, recorded in the brittle, browning pages of the court ledger, were a roll call of the city's founding families: Abernathy, Lanier, Holt. These were men who had likely shared business dealings and social pleasantries with Jabez. They were not impartial arbiters of the law. They were the embodiment of the social order that had been violated, and their role was to act as its stern and unforgiving guardians. The courtroom itself was designed to project an aura of unassailable authority. It was a large, high-ceilinged chamber, the walls paneled in dark, almost black, Georgia pine. The air was heavy and still, thick with the smell of old leather, drying ink, and the faint, acidic scent of human anxiety. Light struggled to penetrate the tall, grimy windows, falling in weak, hazy columns that illuminated the swirling dust. The magistrates sat on a raised dais behind a massive, carved wooden bench, a physical manifestation of their elevated status, forcing all who came before them to literally look up to the face of the law. Cudjo was brought into this intimidating space in heavy chains, the clanking of the iron links on the stone floor, the only sound in the packed, silent room. The spectators, all of them white, filled the hard wooden benches, their faces a uniform mask of grim, expectant curiosity. There was no defense counsel appointed for him. The concept of legal representation for an enslaved person accused of murdering their master was a legal and social absurdity. He was an object of the law, not a participant in it. He was there to be judged, not to be defended. He stood before the magistrates, a solitary, shackled figure, his rough cotton clothing a stark contrast to the severe black coats of the men who held his life in their hands. The charges were read by a clerk, his voice a droning, emotionless monotone. Cudjo was accused of murder, a crime against the state, and of insurrection, a crime against the very fabric of their civilization. The inclusion of the second charge was crucial. It elevated his act from a personal crime of passion to a political act of war, justifying the collective punishment that had already been meted out to the enslaved community and sanctioning the ultimate retribution to come. The testimony was a carefully orchestrated recitation of the established narrative. Sheriff Beaumont took the stand first, his testimony a blunt, factual account of the scene in the study, his language direct and unadorned, which only served to heighten the horror of the details. The neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, recounted hearing the scream and being the first to witness the aftermath, his voice still trembling with a kind of horrified awe. Several other witnesses were called, each adding a small, reinforcing detail to the edifice of Cudjo's guilt. A man testified that he had sharpened a wood axe for Cudjo the week before the murder, a mundane act now imbued with a sinister, premeditated significance. Another recounted seeing Cudjo near the riverbank on the morning of his capture, describing his demeanor as unnervingly calm, a detail that was presented as evidence of a cold, unfeeling nature. A significant portion of the proceedings was given over to a religious framing of the crime. The rector of Christ Church, the same man whose sermon the master's family had heard on the morning of the murder, was called as a witness for the prosecution. He was a tall, ascetic man with a powerful, resonant voice. He did not speak of evidence or facts. He spoke of sin, of the sacredness of the social order, and of the profane violation of a holy day. He described the master as a pillar of the community, a devout and God-fearing man. He described Cudjo's act not merely as a murder, but as a sacrilege, a blow against the divinely sanctioned hierarchy of master and servant. He quoted scripture, his voice thundering through the silent courtroom, speaking of the duties of servants to obey their masters. His testimony transformed the trial from a legal proceeding into a kind of morality play, a public exorcism of the evil that had been unleashed upon their righteous community. The murder was no longer just a crime. It was a symptom of a deeper, spiritual sickness, a manifestation of the inherent sinfulness that the institution of slavery was meant to control and contain. Throughout this entire performance, Cudjo remained a silent, impassive observer. He stood in the witness box, his gaze directed not at his accusers or his judges, but at some indeterminate point on the far wall. He did not react to the horrific descriptions of his own actions. He did not flinch at the rector's condemnations. He seemed to have withdrawn to a place where the words and rituals of this courtroom could not touch him. His silence was a profound and unsettling mystery to the men who judged him. They had expected a confession, perhaps a plea for mercy, or at the very least, a display of the savage, animalistic rage that they believed had motivated him. His stillness was a denial. It refused to give them the emotional satisfaction they craved. It refused to fit into the simple, monstrous caricature they had constructed. The only flicker of engagement came when a magistrate, frustrated by his non-responsiveness, asked him directly why he had done it. Cudjo slowly turned his head and looked at the magistrate. For a moment, the spectators leaned forward, anticipating a revelation, but he offered no explanation. Instead, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, the same smile that his master had seen in his final moments. It was an expression of something so alien, so far beyond their comprehension, that it was seen as the ultimate confirmation of his demonic nature. The smile became the final, irrefutable piece of evidence against him. It was not an explanation, but it served as one. It was the smile of a man who was not mad, but who had simply stepped outside the bounds of their shared reality, who was operating according to a set of laws that they could not begin to understand. The verdict was delivered without deliberation. The lead magistrate, his face a mask of grim, patriarchal certainty, declared Cudjo guilty on all charges. The sentence, like the verdict, was a foregone conclusion. He was to be taken from the courthouse to a place of public execution, and there be hanged by the neck until he was dead. The date was set for the following day, a testament to the city's desperate need to complete the ritual and excise this cancer from its midst. The sentence was not merely a punishment for Cudjo, it was a message, a brutal and unambiguous warning to every enslaved person in the state of Georgia. It was the final, authoritative reimposition of the order that had been so violently disrupted. Cudjo received the sentence with the same unnerving calm he had displayed throughout the trial. The smile was gone, replaced once more by his impassive mask. As he was led from the courtroom, the chains clanking his slow, deliberate progress, a wave of relief, mingled with a lingering, unshakable dread, washed over the spectators. They had their verdict, they had their sentence, they had their monster, but they did not have an answer. The trial, for all its pomp and certainty, had failed to penetrate the silence of the accused. The transition from the formal judgment of the court to the final, bloody spectacle at the gallows was now set in motion, but the central question of the affair would remain, hanging in the humid Georgia air long after the body had been cut down. The dawn that followed the trial was not a reprieve, but an inhalation. The city of Macon held its breath, suspended in the grim, humid anticipation of the final act. The verdict had been delivered, the monster identified and condemned, but the ritual was incomplete. The civic body, having diagnosed its sickness, now required the surgical excision, the public and bloody spectacle that would restore it to health. The gallows, a stark and skeletal structure of new-cut pine, had been erected overnight. It did not stand in the civilized confines of the courthouse square, but in a fallow cotton field just beyond the city limits, a place where the red clay earth was bare and exposed to the full, unforgiving glare of the Georgia Sunday. The choice of location was deliberate. It was a liminal space, neither town nor country, a stage set upon a piece of earth that was itself a symbol of the wealth and the labor that lay at the heart of the entire affair. It was visible from the main road, a stark and unambiguous message to all who passed, a new and terrible landmark in a landscape previously defined by church steeples and the columns of grand houses. The execution was scheduled for noon, the same hour that Jabez had called Cudjo in from the fields the day before. The timing was a piece of cruel, symbolic poetry, a final, authoritative reenactment of the master's power over his servant's time, even in death. Long before the appointed hour, the crowds began to gather. It was a civic event, a grim holiday. Merchants closed their shops, and planters rode in from their country estates. They came in wagons and on horseback, their families in tow, the atmosphere a strange and unsettling mixture of a county fair and a public dissection. They jockeyed for position, for the best vantage point from which to witness the final, convulsive moments of a man's life. Their presence was a statement of communal solidarity, a collective act of bearing witness that would bind them together in the shared memory of the event. But this was not the only audience. By order of the magistrates, the enslaved population of Macon and the surrounding plantations were compelled to attend. They were marched in silent, orderly columns, their overseers riding alongside them, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the ground. They were the true intended audience for this piece of theater. The gallows was not merely for Cudjo, it was for them. It was a lesson, a sermon delivered in the brutal, unambiguous language of rope and wood. The procession from the courthouse began shortly before the noon bell. It was a small, formal parade of power. Sheriff Beaumont rode at its head, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He was followed by a wagon, in the back of which sat Cudjo, his hands and feet shackled. The rector from Christ Church rode beside the wagon, his Bible held firmly in his hand, his expression one of solemn, spiritual purpose. A small contingent of armed guards flanked the procession, their presence less a practical necessity than a part of the ritual's pageantry. As the wagon rumbled through the dusty streets, a hush fell over the crowds that lined the route. Cudjo sat upright, his back straight. He did not look at the faces that stared at him, the mixture of hatred, fear, and morbid fascination. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the hazy, shimmering line where the earth met the sky. He was a man already gone, a ghost being transported to the site of his own final disappearance. When they reached the field, the wagon was brought to a halt at the foot of the gallows. The heat was immense, a physical, suffocating presence. The red clay reflected the sun's glare, and the new pine of the gallows gave off a sharp, resinous scent that mingled with the smell of dust and sweat. The cicadas, as if on cue, began their deafening, high-pitched drone, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Cudjo was led from the wagon to the base of the wooden steps. His movements were not the shuffling gait of a defeated man, but the steady, deliberate tread of one who is walking toward a known and accepted destination. He ascended the steps without faltering, the sheriff and the rector following close behind. From the platform, he could see the entire panorama of his life, the city with its church steeples, the distant, green line of the river, the vast, subjugated landscape of the cotton fields, and the sea of faces, black and white, that had gathered to watch him die. The rector stepped forward to perform his final duty. He opened his Bible and began to speak, his voice loud and clear, carrying over the silent crowd. He spoke of the eternal soul, of the possibility of redemption, even for the most grievous sinner. He offered Cudjo a final chance to confess his sins to God, to beg for a mercy in the next world that he had been denied in this one. Cudjo stood silent, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. He did not look at the rector. He did not bow his head. He offered no sign that he had even heard the words. His refusal to participate in this final, symbolic act of submission was his last, silent defiance. The rector, his offer of salvation ignored, concluded with a brief, formal prayer, and stepped back. It was now the sheriff's turn. He approached Cudjo and, in a practiced, almost perfunctory motion, placed a rough, black sackcloth hood over his head, plunging him into a sudden, featureless darkness. He then settled the thick, coarse noose around his neck, pulling the knot tight behind his ear. He stepped back and looked to the noon Sunday. The church bells in the city began to toll the hour. At the final stroke of 12, the sheriff kicked a lever at the side of the platform. The trapdoor beneath Cudjo's feet fell away with a loud, hollow bang. His body dropped. The rope snapped taut. A collective, involuntary gasp, a sound of both horror and release, went through the crowd. The ritual was complete. In the days and weeks that followed, the official narrative of the event was solidified, etched into the permanent record by the city's two primary instruments of truth, the press and the pulpit. The Macon Telegraph, in a series of articles, meticulously stripped Cudjo of any semblance of humanity. Its editor wrote that the man who had been executed was not a man at all, but a vessel for a savage and primitive evil. The writer reported that Cudjo's act was a terrifying reminder of the thin veneer of civilization that held back the jungle, and a powerful argument for the necessity of the firm, paternalistic hand of the slave system. The smile, that single, enigmatic gesture, was repeatedly cited as the ultimate proof of his demonic nature. It was described as the triumphant leer of a fiend who took pleasure in his own damnation. These articles were read aloud in taverns and on the piazzas of the grand houses, their words becoming the accepted, unassailable truth of the matter. On the Sunday following the execution, the city's clergy picked up the same theme, weaving it into their sermons. From the pulpit of Christ Church, the rector who had accompanied Cudjo to the gallows delivered a powerful oration on the subject of order and obedience. He took as his text the passages from the Pauline epistles that command servants to be obedient to their earthly masters. He presented Jabez as a martyr, a man of civic and Christian virtue who had been struck down by the forces of chaos and sin. He presented Cudjo as a Judas, a betrayer who had turned against his benevolent master. The execution, he argued, was not merely an act of civic justice, but a necessary and righteous act of spiritual cleansing, a purging of the evil that had been allowed to fester. The amen that echoed through the naves of the city's churches that morning were not just a response to a sermon. They were a collective endorsement of a version of history that absolved the community of any complicity in the tragedy, a narrative that located the source of the horror not in the suffocating injustice of their own system, but in the supposedly corrupt and godless heart of a single man. With the passage of time, the official history was absorbed into the softer, more malleable substance of local legend. The story of Cudjo of Macon became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to frighten disobedient children. His name became a synonym for a particular kind of monstrous, inexplicable violence. The details of his life, his history, the long silent years of his labor, the private ledger of his humiliations, all of it was erased. All that remained were the fragments, the sensationalized artifacts of the crime, a holy day, a brutalized body, and a terrifying, incomprehensible smile. He was no longer a person who had once lived and breathed and suffered. He had become a symbol, a two-dimensional figure of pure malevolence, his story a convenient and terrifying shorthand for the deepest fears of the slave-holding South. His silence, the one thing that had been truly his own, was a vacuum that the community had filled with its own self-serving nightmares. What, then, endures? The grave of Jabez can still be found in the old Rose Hill Cemetery, a substantial marble monument, its inscription now softened and blurred by a century and a half of rain and humidity. It speaks of a beloved husband and father, a respected citizen taken from his family by an act of savage treachery. It is a solid, physical testament to the version of the story that prevailed. Of Cudjo, there is no physical trace. His body was likely buried in an unmarked pit, his final resting place as anonymous as the countless others who had lived and died under the yoke of bondage. His only monument is the story itself, a narrative from which his own voice has been surgically excised. The Ocmulgee River still flows past the city, its slow, brown current carrying the red silt of the Piedmont toward the sea. It is the only witness that remains from that time, a silent, unceasing observer of all the human dramas that have played out on its banks. It holds the memory of that Ascension day, the heat, the fear, the blood, and the silence. It keeps these secrets in its depths, as inaccessible as the thoughts that lay behind Cudjo's smile. The final, unsettling question is not what the smile meant, for that is a question that can never be answered. The real question is what it means to live in a world that can create such a smile, a world that can push a man to a place where the methodical destruction of his oppressor becomes an act of serene, absolute, and terrifying liberation. The file on Cudjo of Macon is now sealed. Your presence in these shadowed archives is a vigil we are grateful for. If you have just discovered this channel, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to ensure you are with us when the next record is unsealed, and leave your thoughts on this case in the comments below.